our show sponsors, RealAg Shops, Corteva Enlist E3, and ADAMA Canada. While other sources of innovation run dry and fail to understand your needs, ADAMA is here to deliver, and we're all in on you. Talk to your ADAMA sales rep today. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Agronomists on International Agronomist Day. Now, Ray DeBenko, I don't know if you're making that up, but I'm going to assume you're not. And even if you are, I'm going with it. I'm rolling with it. Okay. Yes, I am Lyndsey Smith. It is Monday night. That means we are here for the Agronomists. If you collect CEU credits, you can qualify for some of those by watching tonight's broadcast. Just head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists tomorrow morning. Let us know you took in the broadcast, and away we go. Okay. So hello to Kevin. Hi, Warren's already here. We've got the Real Agriculture team here as well, of course. And tonight we are going to we're going to look a little bit back and then look now and look a little bit forward. We're going to talk about what we're scouting for at sort of that pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest window. We're going to focus on canola and soybeans, but of course, we've got two great experts here that can answer all sorts of different questions. And we will be looking at more of a disease angle, but that doesn't mean we're not going to talk about other things as well. Jason Vogt has joined the chat, Ola from South Central Manitoba. I hope it was a lovely harvest day there, but I feel like maybe it's raining. And Ray says, yes, sad but true. There you go. He missed Cheeseburger Day. But yes, it is, in fact, International Agronomist Day. So bringing in two of our agronomists, maybe international, I don't know, maybe you've traveled. We've got Johanna Lindeboom of Clark's AgriService, and we've got Doug Moisey of Corteva from Alberta. Doug, how are you?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. It's mid-September already. It's kind of wild. And I know it is a very, very busy time of year for both of you, so I do appreciate you joining us here on the chat. I know you came straight from the field, so thank you for that. Johanna, how are things in your neck of the woods?
We're doing pretty good.
Now, we've got we got an hour. Johanna, let's hope you're going to keep with us for the whole time. We're going to ask lots of questions early just in case there's a chance you might lose Johanna, but we're going to try. All right, so Doug, let's start with, we are going to talk sort of that pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest window. We had a chat just a few weeks ago on some of what you were seeing at that swath timing kind of window and some of the most common questions that you were getting. Give us a taste of what this growing season has sort of thrown at you.
Well, let's start with June. June was a little bit of a lion. Mother Nature proved again why she is so vicious, especially here in Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan. It was hot, dry, and we had a lot of crops that the guys were actually farming for crop insurance. And then early in July, the world opened up and the rain started coming, and the next thing you know, we've got crops. So now we're dealing with everything from some decent crops to some very multi-stage crops to crops that basically grew giant plants because they started to flower when conditions started to get good. So everything grew tall, and now guys are dealing with stooky canola, and there's all kinds of things. And then we played with smoke, and then the diseases started showing up. We have everything from powdery mildew that's been showing up while guys are swathing. I had a lot of guys phoning me and questioning me and saying, why is my swather turning white? And of course, I made the joke about maybe he's got a drug addiction, but it's actually just powdery mildew that was showing up. And then we got verticillium wilt that we found here this fall here as swathing time was approaching. And the guys were thinking it was blackleg, but then once we got into the fields, we could tell it was verticillium. And of course, now we got clubroot and late season aster yellows. So it's been a really fun year for disease. Insects were minimal except for cutworms. Cutworms are probably the biggest problem, but flea beetles were basically non-existent this year. So we've had everything go on that could go on. Some guys have got some really nice crops out there, but then there's some guys there that it's going to be a tough year for them. So,
which is part of the reason why we're having this conversation, because there are some very bizarre things, as you said, powdery mildew out there. We all thought this year was going to be a flea beetle infestation. It had been climbing. So I feel like maybe this winter, if we could pick something new to really target, maybe that will mean it's not an issue next year. So I'll maybe start the list. I'm going to go from there. Johanna, hearing that list, how does it make you feel about the soybeans in Ontario right now? A little better?
Maybe a little better. I think we're probably similar situation. Our crop is kind of all over the map stage wise, and we're expecting a bit of a delayed harvest because of having beans that kind of came up at different stages with the weather being so dry. And definitely, if there was a disease to get, you got it this year. Probably had record amount of rain for July and August, I think. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, so Doug mentioned the smoke, of course, just just huge wildfire pressure across the West this year. Here in Ontario, we of course saw some of that from the Quebec fires early in the year. I here in the Ottawa Valley, maybe I saw more of it than other parts, but I know it did make its way all the way down to Toronto. Johanna, was it all that bad for your area for any length of time, or not nearly as bad?
There was maybe a week or two in the spring. I feel like, to be honest, I feel like we might have hyped it up a little bit more than what we actually saw. I spent a week out in Saskatchewan, and like you see smoke pretty quick there.
Yeah.
But I think just with the volume of rain we saw in July and August, lack of photosynthesis is definitely it's a factor for us, and we definitely didn't see as much sunlight as normal. So that's a huge thing for crop development. Was it necessarily all attributed to smoke? I'm not sure about that.
Mm-hmm. So Doug, so similar idea though. I mean, obviously heavy smoke cover
Yeah.
for a way larger window. When was the worst of it for your area?
Most of it, like we had some issues there in early June, which actually, in my mind, because it was so hot and dry, it actually saved the crop it allowed it to get through it. It put it to sleep for a while. And then July, of course, we had the rains, and we had some really nice areas that had a lot of good rain. But where we really started to see the problems is about the second week of August. And as the plants were starting to get into that seed color change mode, and then we were seeing like a week of smoke where you couldn't even see a quarter mile. And so basically, it put all the plants into suspended animation. And so we saw that it wasn't until the latter part of August when we got some good rains that we finally started to see seed color change start to take off a little bit. But,
Mm-hmm.
you know, for me in our area, especially like the Peace Country, northern Alberta, parts of northern Alberta, there were areas in there that when I walked the plots, I could come back 10 days later and see no advancement going on.
Wow.
So it did have an effect on us here, and it did keep some of the days cooler, but we did have some days where the smoke wasn't as bad and you could see things happening. But it played a role this year, but there's a lot of other things that helped basically contribute to what was all going on this year.
Mm-hmm. Now, Doug, just one question I had, and I saw it this past week on Twitter. And we talked about this a couple of years ago, calling it zombie canola. I know we saw it in many more areas in 2021 where those really late branches on the canola plant coming out, trying to regrow, flowering when the rest of the crop is maybe you're gauging swath timing.
Yeah.
I can't imagine it was any easier to gauge this year, but how bad was it, and how do you make that call?
Well, and the thing is, it was the zombie canola. So you got to think about June when it was hot and dry there. The way I've explained it to some people, and I've talked to some plant physiologists about this, and we're kind of in agreement on this, is that in June, the canola was basically forming a plant structure to hold 30 bushels, 20 bushels. And then as it started to flower, all of a sudden it started to rain, and then the roots took stock of what was going on, kind of the brains of the operation. And they said, hey, I can now support 40 or 50 bushels. And so what it does is it starts, because the main stem is basically set, it started adding in on the side branches. And because of that good rainfall pattern, the vegetative growth allowed for that long internode elongation. And that's why we're getting this big, giant canola. And then in some areas where the rains came at just the right time, we had guys that are sitting with 9, 10, 12 plants per square foot. And this all came up. And so that's where they're dealing with that. So come swathing time, it became somewhat of a nightmare for some fields. And it was sort of, we were explaining to a lot of the guys. And when I walked with one guy, I said, okay, where is your yield at? And he says, well, it's the stuff that's a week or two away from swathing. He says, then that's what you've got to take. And so, there were guys that were doing that. Looking at it that way, some guys just say, no, I'm leaving it for straight. And there are a lot of guys that just left it for straight. And then whatever Mother Nature gives them, that's what they're going to deal with. So it made for an interesting time. But one of the things that I saw was probably one of the bigger mistakes that was going on this year is that because of all the branching, guys were following this 50% on the main stem seed color change, and they started swathing. And they were swathing it so green that we've heard some guys mentioning is that it's still not cured in the swath and it's been down for 3 weeks. Right. And that's because they weren't paying attention to those side branches where a lot of the yield is this year on some of these plants. So, and a good example, I was in a field here a couple of weeks ago and we counted 47 pods on the main stem and we counted 420 pods on the side branches. So
it's a bit of a difference. Yeah, there's your zombie canola. You got to pay attention. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now Warren, who's out here in Eastern Ontario with me, he put a pre-harvest pass on the Azuki beans today, and of course it's pouring rain now. So I hope you got your rain fastness in there, Warren. Johanna, what are things looking like for staging down where you are? Is everything pretty much, as far as dry beans, edible beans, ready to roll or no?
Depends where you are. I had a chance to get up to the farm show last week, and I'd say like getting up towards Woodstock and that they're definitely further along. I think there's some edible bean harvest started. Where I live, closer to Lake Erie, we have fields that we just started to see some color change in the last couple weeks, which is really promising. We also have some fields that are bright green. So we're preparing for a late harvest. We're more used to it. I think anyone that was able to get planted early, there's probably going to be a little bit of harvest going on. But in my immediate area, I would be probably surprised to see a combine roll before October 1st. Sorry.
Yeah. Now, what does the yield potential look like? Like, let's say the weather holds and these beans all make it to the finish line without a disaster. Is the guess that this later season might play into bigger yields or no?
I think it's pretty solid, actually. I think the top end is probably shaved off. Like, I don't know if we'll be seeing as many 70 bushel fields on those super long day beans, but because we went into the season with some thinner stands because of it being so dry, I don't think disease is as bad as it could be. And I've also heard, kind of first time for me, but I heard that sometimes the repeated days of consistent rain and maybe a little bit less humidity is not as conducive for something like white mold. But I've been surprised how well the beans are holding up. There's definitely disease out there, but not a lot of like massive disaster fields. I think if we get into a wet fall, we're going to be looking at a different scenario.
Mm-hmm. All right. So tonight, one of the things I kind of want to unpack is, I mean, obviously everything, you get your final answers when you work everything to yield. That makes sense. But there are several assessments and observations we can make now or at harvest or post-harvest in these fields that tell us a story of how well we did on some things. Was the fungicide pass worth it? Did we get our plant stand counts? What diseases are we looking at? And Doug, you've alluded to the fact that, especially in canola, we have several that can be confused for a different one. So we're going to unpack some of those. But Johanna, I'll go to you on this one as far as, at least right now, and you're right, we still have a bit of growing season to go. What was the sort of take on white mold control earlier in the season, and was it the right call?
I think early season was probably a good call. I can't take credit for it. Lauren Benoit had done some research and found some articles that correlated white mold control to canopy closure. And I kind of went off that this year because in our area, when you hit R1, there's still a foot between the beans in a lot of cases versus in somewhere like Oxford County, they're full canopy closure. So our fungicide application is usually a little bit delayed. But I think the timing for a lot of growers this year was very dependent on the weather. And I think we really struggled to get fungicides on at canopy closure. It seemed like it was a race to get to the field just because everything was underwater. So I think that's going to play into disease control a big part. And just because the fungicide went on, there's a chance that disease set in before then because of some of this weather. And I think we have to factor that in. And also, what stage did it get applied?
Okay. Now, Doug, you did mention, and so we'll bounce to a clip in just a second. You did mention verticillium stripe or verticillium wilt. It's a relatively new disease of canola. Are you seeing it in your area for the first time, or has it been there for a while, you think?
Well, and that's a hard one because, as much as you think that you know everything or you try to know everything, something throws a curveball at you and maybe you miss it because you said, oh, you just write off. And a good example is that we were writing off some fields here a couple of years ago that we thought were just straight blackleg. And it didn't look like the stalks didn't meet, but because we didn't know enough about verticillium, and then this year we started seeing some fields that were showing the same symptoms of blackleg showing up, but then we discovered that when you cut above it, especially early on, you'd see, and you cut the cross section of the canola and you see this star inside the cortex, and then, oh, okay, so there's verticillium. And so I think it's been here longer than what we think it has been. It's just that now it's become more and more to the forefront, especially for some guys here that were in the drought situations in the south and into those drier areas where they had a lot of premature death going on and they couldn't quite explain it. And they're saying, I've got lots of blackleg. And, in the field that I found by Camrose, it was verticillium, and yet we thought it was blackleg to begin with. So it's making its way. I think it's been around longer, and I think it's just been misdiagnosed. And the thing that we learned, and we are learning as we go along as an agronomist, is that we have some labs that we're testing, and we're discovering that, one lab there, it's right on par, and it's just been confirming. And so we've been sending samples into those labs and making sure that we are on our correction. We're getting it back. It's positive for verticillium. So it tells me it's been around for a while.
Yeah, more than likely. All right. And you brought up a really good point that I want to tackle right after this clip. Producer Jay, if you could cue up the clip, we are going to talk about those stems. And I know that soybean stems tell us some tales as well, Johanna. I have a question about brown stem, right? So we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you could cue it up, Producer Jay, we'll talk about blackleg versus verticillium in this clip with Jeanette Gauthier.
So what sort of diseases could you be looking at if you're out there and you're looking at those stems post-harvest?
I think one that we commonly talk about is blackleg, something that's easy to look for once you're done harvest. Sclerotinia can be another one that's easy to identify at that timing if you didn't look a little bit earlier. So for sure, that's something we do. We pull out some plants after harvest. It's nice and easy to walk in the field. You get to look at the stem, and then we do some clippings. So I have a stem here. So I think one of the important takeaways from this season is that often we do have some nice looking crop, nice green stems. And this year we are seeing a little bit more disease in some areas of the West. And I think it does span a good portion of the West, not just Manitoba. And so definitely doing those stem clippings and looking for that discoloration, but then also linking it with some of the other blackleg indicators. So it might not be easy to see here, but here we have some pycnidia. And the reason why I think this is important is because blackleg is an important disease to identify, but it's important to identify it correctly because it can be a big yield robber. But just because there's discoloration on your stem clippings or on your outer stem doesn't mean that you actually have blackleg.
So then how do you tell for sure that you do have blackleg?
That's a great question. So I think knowing what some of the other diseases look like, so for Manitoba, and I did see it moving into areas where we haven't typically seen it before, verticillium stripe seems to be the newer disease that we're talking about. Also does cause some gray discoloration when you clip your stems. And again, post-harvest can be great because then you get to see the microsclerotia, so very different looking, and it peels back. But sometimes if you go out a little bit early or your stems are still a little bit green, it can be really difficult to distinguish those. So I did get asked that by an agronomist, and my answer is that's when you take advantage of your diagnostic labs in the provinces or with some of your other resources, like the Canola Council, for example.
Our sponsors tonight are ADAMA Canada, Enlist E3 from Corteva, and RealAg Shops. The RealAg Shop series is a new video series brought to you by Princess Auto. In this series, check out smart and slick shops from across Canada. And if you know someone who has a great shop, nominate them for a tour by emailing Sean Haney at shaney@realagriculture.com. All right. Not sure what happened with the lagginess there, but I hope it was okay for everybody else. Okay, so the tales that these stems can tell. So a few things, and I think, Doug, you've made a really good point, and that what we've thought was blackleg maybe for a long time might have been verticillium, and that's what we're starting to look for. It is also, I saw just last week before, the first case of brown stem in soybean, and because I'm told, so I was there with Albert Tenuta, so I got quite the lesson in this, is that we have some pretty good genetic resistance to this in our soybeans, Johanna. But did you see more of it this year? Soybean brown stem.
I haven't seen quite as much of it. I saw a lot a couple years ago. Okay. We did see a lot of fusarium in general this year, but I think it could just be an area thing. But it is like they're talking about looking at stems post-harvest. I would say almost with soybeans, it's nicer to look at them pre-harvest because then there's still some living material and it's easier to distinguish one versus another. For me, with brown stem, it's looking at that center pith that usually turns brown versus fusarium or like an SDS. Often it's like the outer vascular tissue that will turn brown and not as dark either, usually more like generally like a light brown discolored.
Mm-hmm. So that was, Tenuta had mentioned that sudden death syndrome and brown stem can look similar, at least from the leaves. But then when you split the stem, you start to see some differences there as well. And that brown stem, it sort of moves from node to node. So it sort of hangs out at a node and then makes its way up and then hangs out at a node and keeps going depending, which was really cool. But not surprising that maybe you haven't seen it a lot, or at least recently, in that it seems to be something that pops up now and again, but we have pretty good genetic tolerance, resistance, whatever you want to call it, to it. So not necessarily a disease of economic concern, but this all brings us full circle to the importance of identifying what is actually happening. So to your point, Doug, about actually figuring out whether it's blackleg or verticillium, or if it's sudden death, or if it's soybean cyst nematode, all those different things. So Johanna, you've actually got some slides that I'd love to touch on some of them because you got some really great images here. Maybe we can start slide 2, I guess, if you want to. Root rot was definitely a huge concern this year. How long did the actual sort of impact of it persist as far as it getting worse and worse? Like, when did it actually sort of start to curtail?
Well, I think it infects early season, right? Which we didn't see maybe as much of that this year. But if you have areas like the way Phytophthora spreads is through water, it's Moisey. So as water moves, the bacteria will move. But I think once we started getting all of those flooding rains, we saw a lot more of it. One of the hardest distinguishments this year, I think, is the difference between Phytophthora root rot and just physical drown out of the beans. Because in a lot of areas, we had beans sitting in standing water for several days, or they got washed up and completely coated with mud. And if those beans weren't able to get washed off later, they would have died. And that's not necessarily a root rot. It's just a plant can't survive when it's underwater. So I think that's something to consider. Definitely a telltale with Phytophthora is those dark kind of reddish brown lesions going from the soil upwards. And then also when it dies, it tends to be more a mid-season. So if you're looking for it, you really want to be looking at it in that July, August timeframe. And it tends to die with the leaves still attached. So that's definitely a telltale sign for me.
So this is one of the other key things that I think is really neat about these conversations. And Doug, you mentioned the premature death, perhaps in patches, those sorts of things, is that there are clues, right, that we have to be following. And so, I mean, neat point, Johanna, on like it dies, then leaves are attached. When we're looking at some of our canola diseases, if we've got premature death, we've got to figure out why. And the same goes for soybeans, of course, right? We often think either white mold or those sorts of things. But Jay, can you? There we go. Yeah, if you can move to slide 3. 3 and 4, I think, are SDS and soybean cyst nematode. So these are things. Yeah, there we go. We're just resizing them on the fly. Okay. So sudden death syndrome. How do I know that's what I've got?
So that intraveinal chlorosis is definitely a telltale. You can see, especially in the picture on the left there, like it's directly between the veins. Usually early on, it might look like mottling. And again, if you split the stem, you'll typically get that like kind of light browning of the pith, of the vascular tissue. But it's one of those things you've got to be looking for early on. It will show up late season, but once your entire field is turning, it's a lot harder to pinpoint those spots. It's a lot easier when you go out in, mid-August and your entire field should be green, finding which spots are yellow and going and looking and trying to figure out what's going on here.
Mm-hmm. And then, so the next one is soybean cyst nematode. Do these, and this question has come up before, do they always or almost always go hand in hand? Like, can you have soybean cyst nematode and not have sudden death and vice versa? Are they disease buddies?
They're definitely buddies. I like that. That's a really good
Yeah,
term.
there you go.
So definitely disease buddies, but they don't always go hand in hand. I did include that picture on the left of the potash deficiency because on the heavier clay soils we have around here, we don't necessarily see as much SDS, but we will see potash deficiency. And oftentimes when we dig that up, that's telltale of soybean cyst nematode. One big thing, you can also get more brown stem rot if you have soybean cyst nematode. It's just those nematodes are doing damage to the roots and they're allowing points for other diseases to come in and infect. So oftentimes one can sort of spur on the other, but they're not mutually exclusive. Like you can have one without the other.
But they're disease buddies. Like thunder buddies, but different. Yeah, there you go. All right. So now, Doug, this brings up a key point about blackleg. So blackleg and verticillium, if we can sort of come back to that discussion, in that blackleg is also a disease that infects very early, right? But it needs entry into the plant. So how early does blackleg infect?
You can actually, I've seen blackleg start infecting at early cotyledon. 1 to 2 leaf stage is when it really can come in early, and that can typically come from an early season hailstorm or a windstorm blowing dust where you get those pot marks. Flea beetle feeding, those will all contribute to vectors to allow the blackleg to go in. The other thing is too, though, is with these tighter rotations that are happening, is that you're going to start seeing as that population start to build, and you'll start seeing blackleg. It will just naturally start infecting just because of what's going on with 2-year-old stubble. And at the end of the day, it's a major disease that we have to be aware of, and rotation can help clean that up just by extending that extra year. But it is going hand in hand with vert, and it just seems like more and more is that the blackleg may be doing the infection, but is it the vert that's actually infecting? And the blackleg now has become sort of the telltale marker that we missed earlier on. So it's like I said, it's part of this whole thing of getting out there, checking. There are ways to figure out whether you do have vert or you have blackleg, and that's submitting samples and then asking the labs to check for the known races of vert. It's just getting out there and looking and basically scouting your fields at the end of the year, right? Or it should have been done actually a couple of weeks ago when swathing was going on, but that's when I like to look for blackleg because you still got the green stems. You can typically see is that what's going on, in my mind.
Mhm. So, and I mean, and to Johanna's point about wanting to identify those problem areas, yes, before harvest.
Yeah,
And certainly that's partially, the different physiology of the plant and those sorts of things. But Doug, same idea. There's things that you can really observe and keep note of, and or maybe look for at
yeah,
swath timing than
yeah.
you would necessarily at post. Now, Johanna's going to rejoin us. She's just switching laptops. We had a bit of a tech issue. She'll be back. No worries there. But this is a good time. Doug, what are you at swath timing? Is that a Sclerotinia clubroot scout?
Oh, yeah, that's a Sclerotinia clubroot scout. In fact, prefer that you're scouting for clubroot a little bit earlier. Clubroot, if it gets in early, excuse me, and it gets going hard, you can actually start pulling clubroot at early flower. Typically, you'll see the flowers are not quite as bright. They're kind of patchy. There's things that you can see and feel that just doesn't look right. And we've seen it this year where we actually had clubroot coming in at bolting time, and it's because of race shift. So you can scout earlier. Now, the Sclerotinia one, it's basically, looking at, in my mind, it's looking at what's going on in June, July for rainfall. What are your rainfall patterns? And then, of course, we never do see the damage that Sclerotinia is doing until swathing time. And this year, there are a lot of guys that are talking about, geez, I should have sprayed. And it is quite evident in parts of Alberta that I've seen where the guy said, no, I'm not spending another dime, I'm not spraying. And then now they're looking at 10, 15, 20% infection levels in their fields. And the worst part about it is that they had full intentions on straight cutting, and now you're kind of going, okay, it's like, what's the prognosis? And for some guys, they're going to straight cut anyways. You're realizing that seed's going to be gone, but it's kind of a way to look at, there's some opportunities to deploy genetic resistance and to use a spray if you have to. So,
Mhm.
that's the whole thing here is that it's swathing time is a good time to scout for Sclerotinia to say, okay, I missed something here.
Yep.
But it's learning to figure out what's happening in June, July, and what the conditions were. And a lot of guys, like I said, in June, were not spraying. And then July, the skies opened up, and then we developed, as you call them, these monster canola plants. Well, they became the new havens for Sclerotinia to survive.
Yep.
So,
Right.
but, it's still not too late to do some scouting, but I think that after the swathings have done, it's a great time to start looking at your plant counts to look at survivability. What did you get with survivability? It's not that you may change your planting decisions or seeding rates right yet, because you could be doing this over a couple of years to get a true handle on what you're getting for survivability in your fields. And
Hmm.
so for some guys, they have been doing it, and what they found is that they've been typically seeding a little bit on the heavier side, and they're able to get back into that sweet spot of 7 plants that we keep talking about all the time.
So, and that's just it. Like tonight, we're focused on diseases, let's say, because it is a good time to sort of do that assessment. And like you alluded to, um, I think on one hand, it can tell you, yes, that spray was definitely worth it, or you kick yourself because maybe you didn't get in there when maybe you should have. But there is a lot more that we can decipher from that at harvest, or that window where we can see where we're at for plant stand counts, weed spectrum, or fall weeds we might need to take care of, and see just how well we did, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's now, Johanna, I'm not sure, how's your sound doing? Do you want to do a little test for me? um maybe not. There we go, she's switching over. We're gonna try. How's that? Can you hear me okay?
Okay, I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, we can hear you.
Sorry.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank
All
you.
right, we're good.
Amazing. We're doing tech swabs on the fly. This is fantastic stuff. Okay. I love it. So that does, on that note, so Johanna, we are at obviously a little, earlier in the season compared to where the canola stand is at in Western Canada. Um, what are you looking for, at leaf drop, at that, not quite harvest timing, but you're getting out there and assessing what's in that field? What are some of the things you're looking for to see how the season went? What are you evaluating at that time?
A few things. So I would say white mold is definitely part of it. It's easier to see, I think, once you have leaf drop, just because you're not trying to dig through those mats of lodged plants, and you can see what's actually lodged and what has white mold. On my slides, I think I've actually got a decent picture of that if you're able to pull it up.
Yeah, which one is that there? The pod and stem blight, is that the one you want?
Yeah, and then there's
Yeah,
a white
that's,
mold slide as well,
and
I
then there's a
believe.
white. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, slide 7, Producer Jay. I think if you can, we've got some sclerotia in the stem and the whole bit.
Yeah, so definitely like you can start splitting stems, and I think that's maybe even something as you're harvesting to look at samples of your grain, because you'll see those mouse turds, like those sclerotia, come up in the grain sample. But one thing I found really interesting with white mold is often kind of similar to Phytophthora, those leaves hang on even after the plant is dead and they sort of stick to it. I think maybe just some of that like fuzzy white mold mycelium helps that. And those plants you can actually pick out a little bit easier at leaf drop. And I think too, standability is a huge factor. I think we're gonna get a really good look at that this year because there's definitely some lodging in fields, and you'll be able to kind of make some variety selections for your ground at that time. And then the pod and stem blight, I'd say, is definitely a large component as well. That's a disease I think that we don't pay a lot of attention to. In 2021, it was a major issue, and we had a lot of seed quality with a wet late harvest. You can see, especially in that one on the right, just the Pycnidia, like they're almost in like a line. So that's really distinctive of pod and stem blight versus a couple of the other diseases that you could see sort of after the soybeans are dying.
Johanna, I don't know that I've ever heard anyone talk about pod and stem blight. And I know I'm not like from here, but we really don't talk about this because I don't think I've really heard much. So why don't you think we talk about it as much as maybe we should? Is it just because it's only really a big issue in a wet fall, or?
Honestly, I'm not quite sure. I think, if it's not something that you see a disease rating for in the seed guide, we maybe don't pay attention to it enough. But it's years like this, especially when you have a wet fall, and to maybe just look at seed quality of fungicide applied fields versus not, I think that would be a really neat evaluation because a lot of these diseases, like it is a stem disease, so it infects a lot earlier in the season. It's just that it looks like it's more visual late season, and it can get worse as you get into a late harvest because the disease will continue to grow, but that infection occurs early on. So a fungicide application is something that would help with that, and I think it's definitely worth looking at kind of seed quality in those scenarios.
Okay, so we are going to talk about seed quality for sure. I also definitely want to get a sense from both of you on some of the things of the notes you take and how it informs the decisions for next year for sure. And I want to talk a bit more about testing. But first, Producer Jay, if you could line up our last read of the night for our show sponsors. Our sponsors for the Agronomists are ADAMA Canada, RealAg Shops, and Enlist E3 from Corteva. Looking for high yields and clean fields? Choose Enlist E3 soybeans. Part of the Enlist weed control system, Enlist E3 soybeans help you control tough weeds, providing herbicide choice and tank mix flexibility. Enlist E3 soybeans, the best in beans, period. All right. Now, Jason Votes got a good point here about sending samples to multiple labs to distinguish between other root rots and Phytophthora. Manitoba Ag Lab, and I don't know how you say that lab in Quebec, determined we had more Fusarium root rot in a variety. So, when it comes to sending off samples for different things, do we have this option of sending to multiple labs, or does it depend on the disease? Doug, I'll start with you. How difficult or easy is this as far as sending labs as an agronomist? Do you have sort of your go-to, or do some and some do others?
We have a go-to lab, but it's actually there's a multitude of labs that you can test with from Manitoba right to Alberta. It's just a matter of you got to ask the right questions. And when it comes to testing for diseases, and I'm going to use Vert as the example. Manitoba, for example, they got a lab there, I believe, that tests for 9 different strains. There's a couple other labs that only test for 2 or 3. So it's a matter of asking the question about how many strains do you test for. So when it comes to Vert, come to Blacklight, you need to ask them, like, what are you testing for? Same with the blackleg. What is the strains that you are watching? Like anybody can confirm blackleg, but can they break it down into the different strains of blackleg? And that's so it's a little bit of, I'll call it boots in the field by the farmer, but homework by phoning the question saying, hey, what do you test for exactly? And I think by doing that, you might find that there's a lab in town Z that does everything you want, and that's what you're looking for. That's a perfect place to send. And if another lab does the same thing, it doesn't hurt to send the same sample to them too, and just let's confirm it, right? So
Especially
I
if it's
just think
something odd.
yes, for something odd, and I just think it's just doing your homework and just it's covering your tracks to make sure that you're getting the right answer to make the right decisions for next year.
Johanna, what are the most common things that you'd be sending in for lab analysis to confirm or make sure you're looking at the right thing?
Soybean cyst nematode, I think, will be number one because that cyst count is really important for management in future. And typically, we're sending that because it's sent as a soil sample. It's going to a soil lab. I can't really say that I've ever sent it to multiple labs. Normally, we're happy with whoever the grower is used to working with. And then I've also worked a little bit with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I think Owen Wally's done a lot of research on Phytophthora, soybean cyst nematode, and SDS as well, trying to get into some of the strains and the races that we're seeing. So we've been part of a survey that they've done annually, but sometimes those test results, they could take months before you get back. So it's an investment, I think, and it takes some time to set up, but it's worth it so you can figure out what soybean varieties you can grow in your area.
So, and that sort of, it's an excellent segue, Johanna. It's like we planned it, but it does bring up, planning for the year ahead. So taking what we're learning either right now in the field or what we're observing, taking those notes, figuring out what you have or don't have, learning, was the fungicide path worth it or slam dunk or maybe on the fence? We, of course, if we start out west, Doug, and we think about clubroot, if you're in a clubroot area, what is your plan of attack on a field that has had clubroot before? What are
Well,
all those steps?
I think the starting thing, and I know it's to try to get this across, is that taking that break. You've got clubroot. It's taking that 2 year break in between. But for some of the guys, and it's not hard for me to say no, but at the end of the day, is that they have to figure out what the economic consequences are and/or choices, and for them, potentially their rotation is 1 and 2. So one thing I'm suggesting to them is that they need to actually start looking at it if they are, and at Corteva, I'm very proud to say is that we know what we're resistant to, and we know what races or what resistance packaging we have, and we have a number of different resistance packages available. And it's a matter of rotating those resistance packages to help manage that clubroot. Now, we are seeing this year we had fields of race shift where the old clubroot resistance that was developed a number of years ago is no longer working. So guys now have to take at least that 2 year break, and they have to rotate into some new genetics, clubroot genetics. And to me, that's the starting point. But it's also monitoring. If you have a little patch, to me, that's a concern. And you need to be saying, okay, that patch can actually spread by the time I come back, just because of the amount of spores that will be spread through the field that could potentially basically hurt what I've already growing for that hybrid that I was growing. So it's time to start thinking is that I need to start rotate hybrids and clubroot resistant hybrids just to make sure that I'm minimizing the impact of clubroot. It's still not 100% guarantee you're still not going to get some plants with some galls, but the whole idea is you want to manage that. So for me, that's the kind of where with clubroot, it's planning out an attack or a strategy that's going to basically go for long-term sustainability. So what I encourage a lot of customers of ours, especially, is that, okay, you grew this hybrid this year. Next year, you're planning on going into, let's say, from Liberty Link to Optimum Glide. So what you're going to do is you're going to rotate to a new clubroot resistant package to help manage this whole clubroot the clubroot resistance idea across your farm. And to me, it's planning not 1 year away. It's planning for the next 5 to 6 years ahead, so that you're not going to get caught up and get caught with your proverbial pants down. That's the way I look at it. So, it's that kind of proactive approach that I think, combined with good rotations is going to be for long-term sustainability for the people that are in the younger farmers. Like, for some of the older guys, including me, we're going to be sitting on a beach somewhere and enjoying the sun here in 10, 15 years. So, but for these younger guys coming up, they have to start thinking, what can I farm in the next 15 to 20 years? So that's what I look at when it comes to club root strategy.
Throw some wheat in there, guys. Come on.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, exactly. It's the same struggle we have in Ontario, right, Johanna? Okay, so club root, of course, I mean, it's an incredibly destructive disease. It is in the soil. It spreads by soil movement. It is, as Doug has outlined, incredibly difficult to sort of get a handle on. Here in Ontario, I think about certainly something like soybean cyst nematode, where once you have it, it's there. But you can work at drawing down some of those levels because that's what you're testing for. So let's maybe start there, although there's lots of other things we can think about. But I sort of, when we think about white mold, I sort of consider it sort of endemic and it's conditions that are really going to drive it. But what's your plan of attack for, say, soybean cyst nematode? Are you pushing farmers to make sure they know whether or not they've got it and at what level?
Yeah, so I'm going to group in SDS with this in the sense that they're soil borne, both of them, and they're getting, kind of alarmingly spread across the province. And I think Doug makes a really good point. We often talk about rotating crops or rotating herbicides, but what about rotating your soybean varieties and your resistance packages within those? I think if every farmer had their way, they'd have their favorite variety and they grow it for the next 20 years and nothing but that. But there's so many differences in the resistance packages, even within, say, something that has the P1 88788. I'm going to botch that up. There's probably an extra 8 in there somewhere. But
There's lots of
within
them.
that, between varieties, there's slightly different resistances to it. And I think by rotating varieties and rotating into some of the different resistances like peaking, and even with SDS, maybe not having the same variety, that means you're probably going to have a slightly different tolerance. And also to know how to look at the seed guide, right? It can be tricky because every company has a different way of decoding it, so to speak. But figure out what those numbers, what those letters mean in terms of your field, so that you can know what race resistance you're getting to, what the field tolerance is. Field tolerance for something like Phytophthora, for example, means a lot more than the race resistance, because we've seen race shifts and we haven't necessarily seen a lot of race shifts in the genetics yet. So that field tolerance is going to mean more. But something like SDS or SCN, we have some really good genetic resistance for that available.
Really good point about reading some of these charts and those sorts of things, in that that is sort of an art in and of itself, is to spend some time getting to know how these things are laid out and how you can compare. But as you both have pointed out, I think there's that added level of, know what kind of resistance is being offered, and talk to your agronomist and figure out, can you be adding a layer of rotating that resistance as well, depending on what it is you're dealing with. No, Doug, on blackleg, it's in some ways a similar kind of thing. We do have race delineation for blackleg, and we've got different resistance there. I know that the industry has tried to sort of make that easier for agronomists and growers to work on. What's the plan there? Is it because that, of course, is more widespread?
Yeah,
It's
no,
sort of an
I,
every year thing. How do we
yeah,
handle that one?
well, and the thing is that I think it's for everybody to understand is that there's two types of blackleg resistance built into plant structures. There's quantitative resistance, which is multiple genes that all work together to create a protection against incoming blackleg, and so they call that adult plant resistance. The plant has to get to about 3-4 leaf stage. These genes start to kick in and they protect the plant. And then there's what they call seedling plant resistance, which is qualitative. And basically, the best way you can describe it is that your evil twin, blackleg, that looks like you, we have a gene in the plant that matches you, so that when you try to break through the cell wall, it takes you out. So, and that's the problem that we have with qualitative versus quantitative when we try to figure out, okay, which one's better. one thing is with qualitative is that it will withstand a lot more pressure. It doesn't break down as quickly. With, or sorry, quantitative. With qualitative resistance, what happens is that if you do get something busting through the door, you can wipe out a whole field. So it's a matter of rotating. Personally, it's just when you select a hybrid, you're selecting something that says R. It's resistant to. That's been proven by the WCCRC. Now, going forward, what you're seeing is that some companies, including ours, is we're going to probably, or we are going into a combination of both qualitative and quantitative resistance, and we think that's going to be the pathway, and that'll just help for blackleg overall in Western Canada. But again, it comes back down to is that we can keep throwing all this stuff out there, but if guys aren't going to take care of the rotations, we will lose it. And we go back, and I'm older than both of you combined, so put it this way: is that back in the days when Gary String at U of A developed Quantum, which was the first blackleg resistance package, it only took 4 years to lose that resistance. Because what did guys do? They started to go back to a 1 and 2 rotation, where before they were forced to 1 and 4. So it didn't take long to lose it. And so this is the constant battle. And the thing is that we, working with the WCCRC and the Canola Council, all the companies are working hard to get blackleg, and that we're testing even more pressures to make sure we have the right stuff. But again, it's this constant uphill battle that we're going against with blackleg. So the whole idea is that rotate, and keep in control of your volunteers. You know, all these little things, like it was brought up by Johanna, is that like spray out your volunteers, control your weeds, do all the little things that are hosts for blackleg.
Ray says, "Oh my God, what if Lyndsey has an evil twin? What if I'm the evil twin, Ray? What if I have a kind twin and I'm the evil twin? How come nobody ever thinks that?" All right. Imagine that. And Alan, hi, Alan. I think you're in Winnipeg. Blackleg, same as blackleg in cows? No. There is an animal version of blackleg, not the same. Same name, different. But great question. And thanks for that. So, and good points, Doug and Johanna. I know for us in Ontario, you know, a solid rotation is to have 3 crops. The same stands for Western Canada, but Western Canada can have 6 in there. It's amazing. But you're right. Economics drive things, and we still tighten them up based on these sorts of things. Warren is on Team Evil Twin. Good job. Thanks, Warren. But Doug, is that still a challenge to get that, you know, a cereal in between those canola? Like, why is that such a challenge to get one cereal?
It is such a challenge because, number one, you don't want to go a hard red spring on a hard red spring. You know, if you're going to go from a hard red spring, you maybe want to go to a soft white. What happens is, though, is that you got barley, you got oats. Some guys are peas, but there are areas where guys can't grow peas anymore because of disease.
Right. Yep.
So when you start going into oats, if everybody decides to grow oats, well, the price that say today is, let's say, $4 a bushel. Well, if everybody grows oats, now we're down to 50 cents a bushel. And so you get flooding in the market because it's very small markets, where our typical big market drivers are canola, because we're selling into overseas markets, plus we have domestic crush. And then you got the hard red springs that are going overseas, and then we've got it for here. So they are the 2 major crops that everybody wants. And so that's what makes it tough, is that when you look at pricing and economics, and for fear of getting nasty emails and getting shot later, but it is easy to do that rotation, right? And the struggle I battle every year, and I understand the economics and how guys got to make money, but we have to figure out, how do we inject a third crop? And I know some guys have learned how to throw in oats, or they'll throw in barley, or they'll throw something triticale, like not triticale.
One guy feed.
Yeah. So like, there's some opportunity, you know. It's just a matter of that, what are we willing to do, and what do we have to do to make it work? Right.
Now, Johanna, we're running out of time here, but you did mention seed quality a little earlier, and so I wanted to touch on this, because I know we've talked about this on a couple schools and on some other issues of some of the things that we can see that do actually end up impacting the quality of the actual soybean seed. And so what are some of those biggest risks? Are you seeing some of those big risks right now? especially if we are in for a late harvest, maybe a wetter harvest, what is our biggest concern on seed quality?
I think one of the major ones is going to be maturity this year, because we do have soybeans that came up over a period of 3 to 4 weeks in some scenarios. I think I actually have a slide on some seed qualities. I don't know
Yeah,
if we
I
can
think you
pull that
do.
up.
Actually,
Um,
I think it's
but
number 8, Producer Jay.
yeah.
I don't
In
know if
order
they're all
to
your
get some
hands,
of
but
the
there you go.
Yeah, not all
Yeah.
mine, but I think in order to get some of the seed off the fields this year, we're going to see some of those green jelly beans, like in the left-hand picture, especially if we want to make sure that wheat gets in the ground.
Hmm.
It's going to be a push. I think there's a good chance that we could see seed quality issues this year. I'm very interested to see the impacts that fungicide has on it. But if we get
Hmm.
into a late wet harvest, I think you do have to cut some of those products some slack, because a lot of these diseases, once they get hold, if you get a uh, wet late harvest, they're going to continue to grow, and you wouldn't
Hmm.
expect your disease to have control at that point. Like when you spray a fungicide, you're kind of hoping for 2 to 3 weeks control out of that, right? Not 2 to 3 months. So I think you do have to bear that in mind. And that's just something that I think we have to be prepared for. With that in mind, the sooner you can get the beans off the field, the quicker the fungus stops growing.
Hmm. They're also not, I mean, we don't have curative products either, right? So if
Exactly.
if if we went in a little too late, it might have held it back, but yeah, we can't expect 3 months of coverage from one application. They're not miracles, everybody. Kevin, who is a dairy farmer from out in BC, you get a gold star for hanging on this long for an entire discussion about crops you don't grow. And also, we have scared the bejesus out of him, and he never wants to grow crops because he's terrified of all the things trying to kill canola and soybeans. And it's true. It's complicated to farm some of these things. So there you go. Not like dairy farming is easy, Kevin. I got to tell you. So hats off to you. All right. Okay, we are rapidly running out of time here, so I do want to make sure I get a shout out in for anyone who does collect those CEU credits. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist. Let us know you took in the episode, and we'll get you those credits. Just quickly, so Doug, if what's the number one thing you want your farmers to be doing right now in prep for next year as far as field observances?
Soil test, soil test, soil test.
I like it. We
Yeah.
need it on a
Uh,
shirt.
with the rain we had in July and August, the roots really were down deep. Really get down there, minimum 0 to 12. But if you got the time and inclination, I would even go as far as down to 18, 24. Let's get a
Hmm.
good handle. If you look at the Canola Council as a 4R program, there's some opportunities there. Take advantage of them. But we need the soil test to see what our fertility levels are going into the next spring. That'll
Hmm.
help with the planning for next spring. So,
Yep. Good. Johanna, what say you?
I think I think Doug outdid me, because soil test is the best recommendation possible. I was going to go for looking at varietal differences. So we're actually in a
Brilliant.
really, rapidly changing time in the soybean market right now. There's a lot of different genetics on the market, and there are probably more varieties available to choose from than there ever have been. And it's really important to look at those differences on your farm, to look at your local test plots, so you can kind of visually see some of those. This is one of those years where you'll be able to pick out which varieties failed. And it's harder to pick out what's the best variety, but it's a lot easier in an extreme year to pick out the ones that you don't want to grow. So start looking at those, and it kind of helps you narrow down the options.
Process of elimination. All right. Just quickly, you just got it in under the wire, Jason. What is the yield impact? So this one's for you, Johanna. Although Doug, if you want to hop in here, what's the yield impact because of seed size in soybeans? Some varieties have better seed flex, which means holding on to more consistent seed size in good conditions or drought. Do you get into arguments over seed size, Johanna?
Yes.
Oh,
Seed
fun.
flex is a term that I haven't heard before. So,
I've heard it in
for
corn.
soybeans, anyways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
But I've never heard anyone bring up seed flex. So, I can't say I've noticed varietal differences. I know certain varieties have like larger or smaller seed size as a rule. Seed size, to my understanding, makes up for about 30% of yield. I'm expecting this year seed size to make up a lot of yield, because I would say we didn't necessarily see as much pod set as we would have liked to in a lot of beans in the area. We definitely had some thinner populations, but we did have good branching. What we did have was absolutely unlimited moisture for the month of August. And I'm hoping with a couple of hot weeks, we had enough sun to finish it out. And that's that sort of last push when we talk about August making beans. It's that 30% yield driven by that seed size.
All right. Well, stay tuned, everybody. We'll follow up in a couple, let's say weeks. I don't want to say months, and see how that all turned out, but I guess it will be months by the time it's all said and done. All right. That is the Agronomist for tonight. Thank you all for being here in the comments, asking some great questions. Thank you, Doug Moisey. Thank you, Johanna Lindeboom. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you, of course, to our show sponsors, RealAg Shops, Corteva, Enlist, E3 soybeans, and I'm missing one. I always forget. ADAMA Canada. How can I forget? They're like our year-long sponsor. My bad, everybody. It's been a long week, she says on a Monday. All right. Cheers, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Johanna.